Welcome back. In 2019, the Republican-led Florida legislature passed Senate Bill 168, outlawing so-called sanctuary cities and requiring local law enforcement to help federal agents to round up undocumented immigrants. It is important to note there were no sanctuary cities in Florida when the bill passed. Critics say SB 168 has led to racial profiling. A number of groups filed a lawsuit asking a federal judge to strike down the law as unconstitutional. Over the past 2 weeks, a trial was held in Miami, and U.S. District Court Judge Beth Bloom will issue her ruling in the coming weeks or months. After closing arguments were completed Friday, I spoke to one of the attorneys, Paul Chavez, with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Well, let me ask you this. Is this largely a hypothetical argument, or do you have actual instances since the implementation of SB 168 where you believe individuals have been discriminated against or caught up as a result of this law and unfairly targeted?
We do. We have both anecdotes and we have the hard data. So throughout the trial, each of our plaintiffs described horrendous stories of racial profiling. People being pulled over for pretextual reasons or no reasons at all. We heard the story of a woman who was driving her daughter to work, was pulled over, was told, "I'm pulling you over because you don't have a driver's license." Of course, you can't tell if somebody does not have a driver's license by just looking at them. Thus the idea that perhaps this is racial profiling. All to then have CBP called to the scene. So this woman was never given even a ticket, but yet she ended up in the deportation pipeline. We heard stories from our plaintiffs of passengers in cars being asked about their immigration status, eventually being arrested, taken to jail, and to be fingerprinted. We saw the hard data indicating who actually gets arrested, for example, for driving without a license. For most people, most of the time, that just results in a ticket. You don't have a license, you get a ticket, you go handle it, you move on. For communities of color, particularly immigrants and those perceived to be immigrants, they're arrested for that, taken to jail, fingerprinted, and then once they're fingerprinted, they're caught in the web of federal immigration enforcement.
You talked before also about the intent of the law being discriminatory in nature. How do you prove that the law's intent was to discriminate against individuals?
Sure. I think through the course of the trial, we did that in a couple ways. We talked about the plaintiffs sounding the alarm, letting legislators know that this is going to cause trouble. This is causing already fear throughout the immigrant community. This is going to destroy any of the trust that's been built between police and the immigrant community and those that serve immigrants in Florida. They did their best to warn the legislature that this was going to happen. And in fact, it did. We also saw the legislator, particularly the key sponsors of the bill, including Senator Gruters, working hand in hand with anti-immigrant hate groups, and in particular, Fair and Fleming. They shared draft model legislation. They suggested changes. They provided input. They provided advice and promotion of SB 168.
But why is that relevant? If Senator Gruters ends up, conferring with different groups, and they offer suggestions on language, doesn't that happen regularly? Just because you may not like the group offering the suggestions to Senator Gruters, why does that make this unconstitutional?
Sure. So one of the factors in the Arlington Heights factors, which is what the court is looking at, includes the sequence of events. How did this law become law? What was happening in the background and how it moved forward? And that's a key component of this, that the biased data that was provided from Fair to Fleming to the legislatures was actually eventually used in a Senate committee report.
Well, when you say biased data, what do you mean by biased data? What data did they provide that was unfair or untruthful?
So Fair provided a list of sanctuary jurisdictions in Florida. We don't believe that there actually was any sanctuary jurisdictions in Florida. So that's what kicked it off. This was an anti-sanctuary bill. And so now we have legislators, key legislators, listening to hate groups about their definition of a sanctuary city bill, or of what actually even is a sanctuary city, and then their definition of which jurisdictions can be included in that. And the bias comes from the way they determine what a sanctuary city is or a sanctuary jurisdiction.
Doesn't the legislature, though, have a legitimate reason to want to pursue legislation like this in the interest of public safety?
None of the rationales that they advanced were borne out by the evidence, particularly the public safety rationale. We saw that in the years leading up to the passage of SB 168, crime was actually falling at the same time undocumented immigration was going up. We saw that public safety pretext over and over again. Senator Gruters said this is about one thing and one thing only, public safety. But we know that's not true because it couldn't be. This does not make anybody safer. It particularly doesn't make Black and brown people safer that are going to be increased victims of racial profiling.
Well, I saw a statement from Senator Gruters that, for instance, there is a legitimate concern about, undocumented immigrants driving without licenses, not being, having the proper credentials to be able to operate a motor vehicle, and that this is one way to correct that fact and, let undocumented folks use public transportation. That's one of the positive outcomes that could come from this law, is scaring people who should not be driving from driving.
I think that really illustrates his callousness. I think, as the only expert in the case testified, that driving without a license is the catch-22 for immigrants. In the state of Florida, to be able to get to work, to be able to do anything, you need to drive. I think that if this whole law was about making sure that people don't drive without a license, it sure was a roundabout way to do it.
Well, let me go back to something you said a couple moments ago. You don't accept the notion that there were any sanctuary cities or sanctuary counties in Florida, and so therefore there was no need for this law. But is there not a relevant need for the legislature to draw a line somewhere and say, even if we accept that there are no current cities or counties that act as sanctuary cities and counties, that we are now prescribing this is what will happen to you if you do in fact become a sanctuary city or county? Isn't that in the legislature's interest?
I think the Supremacy Clause to the United States Constitution separates what is the duty of the states and what is the federal government's duty. Immigration is always the key example of that. We don't want states adopting their own immigration laws. We don't want 50 different states determining immigration status. We don't want 50 different states or even localities determining how they're going to interact vis-a-vis immigrants. The country needs to speak as one voice on immigration.
In essence, though, hasn't whatever the state wanted to achieve, whatever damage that has been done, hasn't it already been done? Because even if you prevail, let's say that Judge Bloom rules the law unconstitutional, the state will almost immediately appeal the decision, which will tie it up into the Court of Appeals and then possibly eventually to the U.S. Supreme Court, which has not looked very favorably on immigration-related cases in the past. But more importantly, hasn't the state sent that shuddering message, that chilling message? Wasn't that the purpose of the law? And if so, aren't you just basically waging a losing battle here that hasn't the state already won in their way?
I'd agree that was definitely a purpose of the law, to strike fear in the immigrant community. But there's also a lot of local jurisdictions that have done a lot of good work to make sure that the immigrant community is part of us. Particularly, this is true, I think, in parts of Florida with such a high immigrant community, or those of us that are the sons and daughters of immigrants. That it's a very small percentage of the population, I'd like to think, that is trying to send that message. So once this is reversed, the good work of welcoming the immigrant community back into our arms can continue.